Okay, guys, welcome. And we're now talking about revolutions. We're going to be doing two sections. One section on the American Revolution, mostly causes, events leading up to the American Revolution, and we'll be doing another one on the French Revolution that leads us into our first exam. So let's talk about what we call the American Revolution. I start this off starting with a little bit of philosophy, a little bit different approach in the sense that, guys, you usually get the American version, and we have to realize there are two sides to this. So let's take a look at some of the issues that were gone socially between the North American colonies and Britain. So let's define it first. What we're talking about is the American Revolution, 1776 to 1783. This is the event in which the American colonies, British North American colonies, 13 of them, broke away from Britain in 1776, declared their independence, and eventually will win their independence and become the United States of America, 1783. What we're interested in, guys, is the causes. Now, clearly, the American Revolution, like the French Revolution, are products of the Enlightenment. The idea that one should govern oneself, the importance of the individual, the rights to have power over one's life and to be able to improve one's life. At least if you're a white male, let's keep that in mind. It's okay. This does not apply to other people other than white males. But in this case, this was their ideal. Now, what was going on? Well, we know as early as the early 17th century, the British began to colonize North America. The first colony in 1607, Jamestown, Virginia. We know that eventually these settlements will turn into colonies, and certainly by 1750, nice round date to start with, we have the 13 colonies on the east coast of North America that eventually become the United States. The relations between the colonies and the British government were very good, at least for a long time. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is because of distance. Britain was so far away from North America that it really just kind of relinquished its power over the colonies. It allowed the colonies to run themselves because distance made it impossible to run things directly. So as long as the British government was making money from trade, making money from the trade on the high seas, business, they were happy to let the colonies run themselves. As a result, by 1750, all the 13 colonies will have their own colonial assemblies in which representatives will be elected by all property owners, just like in Europe, in England. Only property owners were able to vote. In the colonies, amongst the white population, white male population, the only ones allowed to vote, you're talking about well over 95%. Most Americans own some kind of property, and it wasn't very difficult, to be honest and a bit crass. If you wanted to own property, you got your friends together and you moved west and you killed off some Native Americans, cleared off some land, and you were a property owner. By 1750, all the colonies had their own militias. Some were good, some weren't so good, but they had their own military organizations to protect themselves. By 1750, they all taxed themselves. The British government didn't have any taxes directly on the colonists. The British government taxed trade. That's where they made their money. By 1750, all the 13 colonies had a British governor. But that governor, by 1750, that governor's salary was paid by the colonists. The result, of course, is that most governors, I was trying to find a nice way to put it, worked very well with the colonists, because if you didn't, the next year the colonists suddenly say we got a budget crisis and your salary gets cut. So the British governors generally went along and tried to work with the colonists. By 1750, things were moving along well. The British colonists are living well. They have a higher standard of living than most people living in Britain. Most white males own property. They vote. They're raising families. Back in England, a different situation, where you have a shortage of land. Only 5% of the British public actually owned land in 1750, which means only 5% of the British public actually voted. A problem with this becomes immediate, but it's unknown to most people. And the problem is, what we have developing in North America and in Britain are two totally different versions of government or representation. In Britain, as in most of Europe, if you look at your notes, we had something called virtual representation. Virtual representation means that people are elected in Britain. In this case, elected to go to Parliament. They're elected by the property owners, which means 5% of the population. But when they go to Parliament, even though they may have been elected from some specific area in England, London or Birmingham or wherever, they don't technically represent those areas. They represent Britain and the Empire as a whole. So if I come from London and I go to Parliament and you say, well, who do you represent? You say, well, I represent all British citizens. So the British Parliament was a little over 500 members at this time, tended to fluctuate. So the British government, in its idea of representation, believed that it had voted for the best 500 people in the country who would now represent the needs and the wants and the security of the British Empire. This is called virtual representation. But in the North American colonies, they had the development of a type of representation called direct representation. Something that nobody knew about. It just kind of naturally developed. But the idea was I elect somebody to go to my assembly, Virginia, the House of Burgess, first colonial assembly in North America. Somebody goes there. They represent me. Direct representation. If I have a problem, I have a question, I go to that person and say, I want you to deal with this problem because I voted for you last time and I expect you to deal with my issues. That's direct representation. So virtual representation, 500 parliamentarians for every British citizen, 500 to 1. North America, you're having the development of something called direct representation, 1 to 1. I voted for you, you represent me. So later on, when the American colonists are debating and arguing and talking about no taxation without representation, famous quote I'm sure you've heard before, the British government's initial response is, what are you talking about? You're represented. You're represented by the 500 smartest people in the British Empire. And there they are in Parliament. And when the Americans say, well, we didn't vote for any of those people, the British government's response is, well, 95% of the population doesn't vote for any of these people. What does that have to do with anything? We have, in many ways, a war of semantics here. They're using the same words, representation, but they have totally different definitions, but they don't really know it. So while the Americans feel quite justified in saying, I'm not represented, and I need to vote, the British government feel quite justified in saying, we don't know what you're talking about. You're represented just like everybody else is represented in the British Empire. Despite this, there are no real conflicts right away. This problem is coming up. Things are moving along smoothly until 1756. In 1756, you have the French and Indian War. What we call in North America the French and Indian War. In Europe, it's called the 7 Years' War. This is a war between Britain and France, 1756, 1763. It was fought over who had the right to exploit North America and India. Whoever won got to stay in those two places. Whoever lost had to leave. The British will eventually win this war, and the French will have to leave North America and leave India, and the British will begin to exploit both. We'll get back to India later when we're talking about imperialism or 19th century imperialism, but let's talk about North America. So the British fight the French for who's going to control North America. And in 1763, they are victorious. They win. But as they begin to review the 7 Years of War, one of the things the British become aware of very quickly is that their American colonists do not seem to be the patriots that we thought they were. They don't seem to be the people who we thought were going to back us. As a matter of fact, during most of the war, most of the colonists didn't help at all. When it came to money, well, the Americans contributed very little. Fact is that the British government was in debt for £7 million for the North American conflict. By 1763, 1764, the British government's beginning to think, you know what, maybe we have a problem here. The problem is that we've allowed the American colonists to run amok, to do whatever the heck they wanted to do without any real control. And they've begun to have some wrong ideas. The American colonists do not understand who runs the empire and who they owe their loyalty to. And maybe we need to reassert things. You began to see the British problem begin to debate that we've left the colonists alone, we've allowed them to have too many independent thoughts, and we need to fix this. There's a big debate about this idea of revolution, guys. Revolution, the word revolution means change. Were the American colonists in 1776 fighting for change, or were they fighting to maintain the status quo? The argument is that the British government was the ones who were actually trying to change things. The American colonists, in fact, were fighting against change. We're going to see that coming up, I hope, here. Now, is that important? Well, sure, it's important. I mean, we like to think of ourselves as a nation of constant growth and change. But in fact, we may have been born from a very conservative movement. A movement to maintain the status quo. And that would explain a lot, because we are, as a nation, historically a very conservative nation. I know we have little periods of liberalism and change that hit once in a while for a decade or so, but usually it's followed by 34 years of pretty conservative society, which we are. So if the revolution is not in fact a revolution, but it is in fact what the British called it, a rebellion, it begins right here, 1764, 1765, when the British government begins to change its policies in North America. It begins to say, the colonists need to pay for the right to be British citizens. They're going to have to fork up something. And the way they're going to do that is going to be through taxes. If you look at your notes, guys, you begin to see 1764, 1765. We have the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act. These are all taxes attempting to collect some cash that will stay in the 13 colonies. None of this money is supposed to go in place else. It's supposed to stay in the 13 colonies, and in those colonies, it will help run the British Empire. That's the idea. As soon as that begins to happen, many colonists, particularly urban colonists, and you need to understand, guys, that the American Revolution is an urban revolution. Okay? Many urban colonists begin to protest. They begin to say that you are taxing us without our say, that you are being autocratic, and of course, no taxation without representation. The British government's response is, once again, we don't really know what you're talking about. You are represented. By 1766, a turning point really in the American Revolution rebellion, the British government in 1766 made some very important decisions. First decision they made in that year was, we don't really understand why the Americans are upset, but we're going to repeal the taxes. So they repeal the taxes, and we understand they're upset. Then later on in the year, they come to the conclusion that, you know what? We think we do know what the problem is. The problem is the American colonists think they run their part of the empire, when in fact they don't. We run the empire. And it's our fault. It's our fault. What the British called salutary neglect. Salutary neglect. And we neglected you. So now we need to reassert. We need to clarify things. So in 1766, they passed something called the Declaratory Act. The Declaratory Act essentially said, we run things, not you colonial assemblies. Parliament runs things. Which sounds all fine, guys, except when you actually look at it and you say, okay, we've told you we run things and we're the boss, but we repealed all the taxes. If you're the British taxpayers back in England there, you're looking at this and going, this is not so good for us. If the British colonists aren't paying for anything, then we're paying for everything. By the end of 1766, the British taxpayers begin to rebel. They begin to refuse to pay taxes. They begin to put pressure on Parliament, saying, hey, we're not paying for everything. The colonists need to put in their fair share. By 1767, and again, guys, I know it's quick, but look at the general overview. This issue is about money. Right? It's about who's going to pay and where's that money going to come from. By 1767, the British government had come up with what they think is a very, very clever plan. We'll pass tiny taxes on lots of different things. Okay? These are called the Townshend duties. T-O-W-N-H something. Ins. Townshend duties. It's in your notes. The Townshend duties were on lots of different items. The idea being that the tax will be so tiny that nobody could possibly protest about these things. And by sheer volume, we'll make money. Right? So they put taxes, tiny tax on things like glass. Right? There's no replacement for glass. If you're going to use glass, you got to have glass. All right. Paint. They put tax on paper. They put tax on lead. Lead used for bullets. Remember back then, they're shooting these rifles. Your rifles shot the lead shot. And of course, the most popular drink in the colony is tea. The idea, again, we'll make so much just in sheer volume that we'll make enough money to help pay off our debts. The American colonists immediately begin to protest. They protest the Townsend duties, and as a result, you get one of the first pieces of real American propaganda. This is called 1767, Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. It's a pamphlet. Back then, guys, everybody read. The American colonists had one of the highest literacy rates really in the world. American colonists were up over 80% for both men and women who read. And they read everything. One of the reasons, of course, that they read so much was because of that Puritan ethic and that Protestant ethic. The idea that in order to be a true believer, you had to be able to read the Bible. So boys and girls were both taught to read at an early age. But of course, besides the Bible, they read everything else. So they were reading all the things of the Enlightenment. They read John Locke, and they read Adam Smith, and they read Monty. They read everything that was out there. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of newspapers where you could get short stories. But long versions of things were given in pamphlets, long pamphlets. People wrote these pamphlets. They gave them out on street corners. Sometimes they sold them. In 1767, what the British called a radical, John Dickinson, wrote a pamphlet called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. And in this pamphlet, John Dickinson said, the revolution right now is an urban revolution. All the things that really matter right now really matter mostly to people in the towns. For instance, the Townsend duties. There aren't many farmers or frontiersmen out there too worried about paint or where they're going to write their next novel or any of these things. Even lead. I mean, you think, well, they used lead for their bullets. Yeah, but if you're a good frontiersman farmer, you shoot your deer, you run up, you cut the bullet out, remold it. That's why it's made of lead. So these taxes, John Dickinson said, these aren't a big deal to you right now. But if you let the British get away with this, tomorrow they'll come after you. So you better help us now. Right? Protest the Townsend duties. Now I say it's propaganda again. It's because John Dickinson is not a farmer. He doesn't live in Pennsylvania, which would have been kind of the frontier back then. John Dickinson was a lawyer, and he lived in New York. He wrote this as a way of trying to persuade the frontier farm community to get involved in the revolution. Just to take this to jumped ahead here with John Dickinson. When the Americans won the revolution in 1783, 10% of the colonists left and went to Canada so they wouldn't have to live under the American rule. They preferred to live under British rule. One of those who left in 1783 was John Dickinson. So in 1767, he was a radical, but he's not going to stay that radical. From 1767 to 1770, we have a lull. Not a whole lot happens. The Americans protest. They have professional protesters who go to towns and cities. They protest in front of British buildings. No taxation without representation. We want our independence. Give me liberty or give me death, and so forth and so on. But no major conflict. If a revolution is going to succeed, generally speaking, Cuban Revolution, French Revolution, Russian Revolution, they succeed because there's some event. I usually say that because they have blood. There has to be blood someplace that you can sit there and talk about polemics all you want. But if you get something that can make people get excited, the March on the Winter Palace, the Bastille in the French Revolution, something that people can say people gave up their lives for this, you can get people involved. You can get people emotionally involved. Up till 1770, the American Revolution does not have their blood event, but it's coming, and it's coming quickly, and we'll talk about that in the next one.